Hi folks, welcome back to the second part of the Mustang tutorial series. In this episode, we will conduct the taxi and takeoff portion of the tutorial. So let's go and start our taxi. Now before we start taxiing, we have to get on the radio and we're going to have to ask permission to taxi to the runway. So if you see this button here on the throttle, if you click it, the communication tab comes up. So we select request taxi to runway. Okay, thank you. So when we're taxiing in the P-51, it is always recommended that you have the canopy open. So I know it's going to get a bit noisy, but we have to keep the canopy open until we get on the runway. Now the first thing about taxiing in the P-51 is we press our brakes. That resets the parking brake. So now the parking brake is off. We come off the brakes. Now, during the entire taxi process, we're going to have to keep the stick slightly aft of neutral, just slightly aft of neutral. And what this does is that it locks the tail wheel. It stops it from swiveling, so it keeps us straight on our path. However, that being said, it still allows us 6 degrees of left and right traverse. But if we want to make a sharp turn, what we will do is we will put the stick slightly forward. And what this does is allows the tail wheel to fully traverse, thus making us capable of doing sharp turns. Now we can move in the P-51 Mustang via two different mechanisms. One via rudder, or two via the differential braking, so braking left and right. So let's go ahead and taxi. And there we go. Now, you don't need a lot of power to get going on your taxi. You just need to be really smooth with the throttle. And because obviously we can't see in front of us because of the engine, you need to constantly make S-turns or zigzags while you're on the taxiway, just using the rudder, so you don't run into the back of another plane. So we'll just hold short of the runway. And in a P-51 Mustang, when you're trying to brake, you need to be very careful not to press the brakes too hard. Otherwise, your aircraft will just nose down and hit the propeller into the runway. So now let's go ahead and ask permission to take off.
Infield 1-1, request takeoff. Infield 1-1, Cobra ready? You are cleared for takeoff when ready. Climb 300 at QFE 29.87.
Okay, so we have the clearance to take off. Now we're just going to go through a couple of steps as a pre-takeoff checklist. Now normally you could do this on the runway, but I'm doing it before we enter the runway. Obviously there's nobody else here in this map, there's no other aircraft, but normally you want to do this thoroughly, but you want to be quick as well. So let's go ahead and do our checks. So we're going to start from here. Flaps are up, carburetor is in rammed air, normal air, trim tab, rudder is set to 6 degrees right, and elevator is set to 2 degrees nose heavy. Propeller pitch is all the way forward, mixture is in run, fuel booster is on, primer is off, ignition is in both, fuel shutoff valve is on. We have the main left hand tank selected. We have our lights on, battery on, generator on. So everything is good. So now we'll just taxi onto the runway and prepare to take off. We'll straighten out the aircraft, travel for a little bit to straighten out the wheels, and we'll bring her to a stop. There we go. Now I'm going to go ahead and unlock the artificial horizon. Uncage it. Now normally I wouldn't trust this artificial horizon much because it tends to lag and it tends to not work. I mostly rely on my vertical velocity indicator and my turn and slip indicator. Okay, so now let's go ahead and check all our engine instruments. Make sure they're all within the green. Yep. They're all in the green. Now, we're going to go ahead and do an ignition system check. So we're going to run the engine up all the way to 2,300 RPM. There we go. So now we're going to switch the magnetos from both to left only. You should only see an RPM drop of 130. We'll go back to both. And now we'll check the right. There shouldn't be more than 100 RPM drop. And we see that's all working perfectly. Again, we do final check of our engine instruments, and they're all in the green. We power back down. And now we can close our canopy. Now I can do a final check of the control surfaces. Everything is working. So what I normally do is I hold the brakes down. Oh, there we go. As you can see, the artificial horizon is already messed up. So I need to recage it to fix it. So what I normally do is that everybody does the takeoff differently. But what I normally do is I set my rudder to 6 degrees, around 6 degrees right rudder, because the reason why we do this is because when you power up in a piston engine, the torque generated by the crankshaft sort of turns the nose in one or the other direction. Normally in the P-51 Mustang, if I were to power up right now with no rudder trim, the aircraft's nose would turn to the left. So we need to counter this with rudder trim and also with the rudder pedals as well. So normally what I do is I hold the brakes down I'll advance the throttle up to 30 degrees, 30 inches of mercury of pressure in the manifold, and then I release the brakes, control the aircraft with the rudder, hold the stick slightly aft, stick slightly aft to keep the tail wheel locked, and then increase power all the way, maximum, fully forward. And then once I reach 85 miles an hour, so our speed indicators here, once I reach about 90 miles an hour, 85 miles an hour, I will allow the stick to go neutral. What this does is that it will allow the tail to lift, and then we can take off from there. So let's go ahead and do it. Increase power to 30 manifold pressure. Release brakes. Whoop. There we go. Landing gear up. Bring back the engine RPM. And that's the takeoff. I know it wasn't the perfect takeoff, but to be honest, it's quite difficult to do a normal standard takeoff in these piston-driven propeller aircraft. Now, the optimal climbing speed in the Mustang is around 170 miles an hour. And for continuous engine operation, it's recommended to keep it at 45 inches of mercury of manifold pressure and 2,700 RPM. So we're going to go ahead and do that. There we go. And there's Kabuleti. Now, one more thing that I was just about to forget to mention to you guys is that after you take off and you have retracted your landing gear, you should come over here and have a look at the hydraulic pressure. Make sure it is around 100 psi of hydraulic pressure. And also, if you have a look at the amp meter should be around 50. It could be at 100, but after 5 minutes of flight, it should drop back down to 50. If it isn't, you should land immediately. Well, ladies and gentlemen, this brings us to the end of the taxi and takeoff tutorial. I hope you enjoyed it, and if you did and it helped you, please give it a thumbs up, and I'll see you in the next episode. Bye-bye.